Context of White Supremacy. Gus T Renegade in for another program to share constructive information on racism, white supremacy, what it is, and how it works. Opening title for today's show from the soundtrack of Claudine. It's rare that I can find both a song and a movie that are talking directly about what we're going to be addressing today, but there you go. Claudine, the movie, and that particular song, Mr. Welfare. That's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to read a passage from the book and introduce our guest. This is from page 99 of the book we'll be covering today. The opening passage of Children of the Storm still rings true today. The racism that characterizes American society has had tragic effects upon black children. It has given the black child a history, a situation, and a set of problems that are qualitatively different from those of the white child. In a narrower context, American racism has placed black children in an especially disadvantaged position in relation to American institutions, including the institution of child welfare. In the 3 decades since this book's publication, the position of black children in the child welfare system has not improved. In fact, child protective services have become even more segregated and more destructive. As the child welfare roles have darkened, family preserving services have dried up, and child removal has stepped up. Child welfare reflects the political choice to address dire child poverty in black communities by punishing parents instead of confronting the structural reasons for the racial and economic inequality. It is time to face the inescapable reality. America's child welfare system is a racist institution. Page 99 of the book we will be covering today. That book is titled Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare. Our guest, this is her second visit to the Context of White Supremacy. She was with us almost 1 year ago exactly to discuss her other book, Killing the Black Body, which is fantastic. If you have not heard the program or read the book, I would advise you to do so. Our guest, she is a professor at Northwestern University, Professor Dorothy Roberts. Professor Roberts, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Loud and
clear.
Okay,
good. I'm glad to be on your show again.
We are just super grateful to have you back. Thoroughly enjoyed the last visit. And Professor Roberts, super helpful in addition to coming back on the program for a second visit. She tipped us off about Vernelia Randall, who has been on the program to talk about Dying While Black. She also informed us about Dr. Nancy Krieger at Harvard, who also has come by the cows. So she has been super helpful for the efforts here. I would love to hop right into the book because I feel it's so much information I want to get out. I want to be as efficient as possible with time.
Okay.
I'm throwing you a curveball to start because the last time I was doing research for Killing the Black Body, and I saw that you also have written a ton of essays, and I looked at one in particular, Racial Realities in the United States, Adoption Myths and Racial Realities in the United States. It was published in Outsiders Within. I wanted to start with a section from that and then go to the book, if that's okay.
Sure.
This is from page 150, where you write, although I am black, my own father, who I was very close to and loved tremendously, was white. I never questioned that he loved me or that he was a wonderful father to me, but I know just as deeply that the existence of intimate interracial relationships cannot negate or solve the pervasive and systemic racism that persists in the United States. Could you share a little bit more about that paragraph?
Sure. Well, I decided to write something personal there. I usually don't in my work, but the whole collection, Outsiders Within, had personal stories about children who were transracially adopted and now adults. And so it was part of the nature of the book to talk about your personal experience. In my case, I wasn't adopted, but I was trying to lay out at the beginning that the issue I'm talking about, transracial adoption, isn't about can someone of one race love a person of the other race. I think that's a kind of red herring that gets people off discussing, a super emotional topic, and that really isn't related to the politics of racism. And also, so on the one hand, sometimes opponents of transracial adoption say, well, white people can't really love a black person. So I just wanted to dismiss that argument because I personally know that a white person can love a black person and can raise a black child. In my personal case, my father was white, my mother was black, and I know that my father loved me. So I was just trying to put aside the argument about can black people love white people and white people love black people. And then on the other hand, I also wanted to make it clear that I think it's a mistaken argument, a mistaken view to say, well, if black people and white people could just live closer together or learn to love each other, or if we had more interracial marriages, more transracial adoption will end racism. I think that's completely false. During the time of slavery, blacks and whites lived intimately together. We know that many black Americans have in their past intimate connections between white slave masters and their African slaves. That didn't end racism. So intimacy by itself, without social change, without political change, doesn't end white supremacy and racism. So that's why that's what I meant by that statement. What the transracial adoption debate to me is not really about love and intimacy. It's about the politics of which children are available for adoption, how they're valued, and who gets to choose who adopts them. And so even though very often transracial adoption is promoted as a way of eliminating racial barriers, doing away with the different value of children based on race, what it really boils down to is giving whites their preference to who they want to adopt. It's a way of removing any barriers to their adopting black children or other children of color, even children from other countries, if they want to. But most white people want to adopt white children, and white children are still most valued in the adoption market. And it's that latter reality of the devaluation of black children and the privileging of white people who want to adopt that I think we have to focus on. And so that's what I meant in that passage that you read.
Wow. Outstanding. I'm just curious, since you're at Northwestern, are you familiar with Cheryl Giudice? She's also a professor at Northwestern.
What department is she in? Do you know?
I believe she's in African American Studies. I believe she has published a book. It's titled Interracial Marriage Between Black Women and White Men. I know she's an African American.
I'm not familiar with her. Cheryl Giudice, and you're sure it's Northwestern in Chicago or Evanston?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm not familiar with that book. I'm sorry to say. I'm embarrassed to say.
No worries. No worries.
Yeah.
She was on the program earlier this year, and I was curious if you were familiar with her work. Yeah, she's very interesting literature. Maybe you can, look her up.
Oh, I would definitely look her up. Sometimes I teach at the law school, which is on a different campus, and sometimes we law professors don't know everybody on the main campus in Evanston, although I try to, but we're a little bit separate in the law school. So, but I will definitely look her up because I'm actually thinking of a future project that focuses more on this question of interracial relationships and the politics that is surrounding it. So I thank you for that tip. I'll definitely look into it.
Wow. I would love to hear more about the project. When it's done, perhaps you can visit us for a third time. We can
Sure. No, well, the third time is going to be my book that's going to be coming out in the spring on race-based biotechnology. So I'd love to come back for that. And then then I'll start this next project. So that'll be sometime in the future.
Wow. Okay. That's very active. Love to hear it. Very active. I want to switch in and do what I said I was going to do, Shattered Bonds. Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare. This is a pretty aggressive book in some of the statements that you make about the child welfare system. Can you kind of share with our listeners who haven't maybe read the book, can you kind of give them some of the reasons why you wrote this book and the tone, in my view, the very aggressive tone that you set in this book?
Okay. Well, I wrote the book because when I finished working on Killing the Black Body, which was about black women and reproduction and the attempted controls of their reproductive decision-making, I started to become aware that there was another institution, the child welfare system, that had a huge amount of control over black families. And I found out the astounding numbers of black children who are in foster care. Even though black children make up about 13 to 15% of the total number of children in the United States, they make up anywhere from a third to about a third of the children in foster care. And so they're hugely overrepresented, and black children are 4 times more likely than white children to be placed in foster care in the national statistics. But there's some places where the statistics are even more skewed. In Chicago, for example, more than 90% of the children in foster care are black. And I recently looked at statistics in San Francisco, and in San Francisco, black children are almost 20 times as likely as white children to be in foster care, which is just astounding. You think if black children are twice as likely to suffer some fate as white children, it's a lot, but you almost can't wrap your mind around being 20 times more likely to be in a punitive institution. And so it mirrors very much the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system, where blacks are hugely overrepresented and are many times more likely than whites to be in the institution. And I was really shocked that I'd never seen these statistics before until I started investigating this. I'd never seen any books on the topic. You mentioned in your opening a book that was published in the 1970s, Children of the Storm, and that was the only book I could find in 30 years that talked about the role of racism in the child welfare system. So I really felt compelled to write a book that first just documented how at risk black children were for being in the child welfare system, especially foster care, and then to explain why I thought this was racial injustice, why it was a form of oppression for these numbers to be what they were, and explaining that the child welfare system is not just a system that cares for children in this country. It's a system that disrupts families. Social workers that work for child welfare agencies have a huge amount of power to go into homes without a warrant, demand entry, look around, and take children from their parents and place them in the homes of strangers. And usually their decisions are upheld by a court. Most black parents don't have good lawyers who can, or lawyers who can devote time to their case, and so it's often run through very quickly through the court system. And in the end, black children end up spending more time than any other children in foster care, and their parents' rights are terminated more than other children, meaning that a court decides that their parents are no longer their parents. They have no more legal rights to their children to visit them, to have any contact with them. And children are then available for adoption, which relates back to what I was saying about transracial adoption. You have to, when you talk about transracial adoption, you have to ask, why are all these black children available for adoption? Well, it's because their parents' rights have been terminated, and they have been removed from their families, with their families often having no legal rights unless another family member adopts them or becomes a legal guardian. But if they are free in many cases to be adopted by complete strangers. And there are all sorts of other consequences to being in the foster care system. We know that foster care often is a pipeline to the juvenile justice system. And black children are also more likely than other children to age out of the foster care system, which means that they never return home or get adopted until they're 18 or 21. The age differs in different states. But in many state systems, they are then just left to fend for themselves, to either find their families or somehow manage on their own at age 18, 19, 20, or 21, with no money, no supports, just on their own after having spent a good part of their childhood in foster care. So my argument in Shattered Bonds is that this is a form of racial injustice that unnecessarily disrupts black families and is, in the end, this approach, I think, is harmful to black children. The approach of, instead of dealing with a family's problems, removing the child and placing the child in foster care.
Wow. Again, our guest, professor at Northwestern University, Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law, Dorothy E. Roberts. I put it in the description for the program. I am a former foster care worker. As I read your book, I cringed on many pages because I had done many of the things you talked about, terminating rights of parents. I remember doing a termination case where we terminated the rights of a black female, and I think it was within 6 months. And I remember it was like, congratulations, getting back to social services, like, good job. And I was just thinking, like, wow, that is really incorrect to be celebrating. I mean, you know. Man.
Yes. Well, can I say a few words about that come to mind in your experience? What I've found about the child welfare system is that, you know, to explain why is it that black children are so overrepresented, there are lots of pieces that work together. So there are, you know, individual caseworker decisions to remove children from the home. But there are also incentives for caseworkers to do that. So I think in my discussions with social workers, most of them went into the profession not to destroy families. They went into it to help families. But what they find is that there are pressures on them to remove black children from their homes because there aren't alternatives. and they have supervisors telling them that they have to do something, and there's nothing else they can do to improve children's lives in their minds but take the child out the home because they have no other resources to deal with. Like you said, they're congratulated. There are rewards for terminating the parents' rights, for getting children adopted, whereas there are no, or at least fewer, rewards for keeping families together. Then there's the pressure of the media. The media rarely talks about the harms of breaking up families, but heaven forbid something should happen to a child in their home. That makes national news. So there's pressure on judges and supervisors and social workers to try to keep the child safe outside the home rather than within the home. And then there's also just national policy that comes from Congress, as well as state and local policy. But federal policy is important because states receive huge amounts of federal monies to maintain their system. And so the rules that come from Congress help to determine what caseworkers do. And right now there are incentives for adoptions. In fact, with the Adoption Safe Families Act, states get extra money. They get a bonus for increases in adoption, whereas they don't get a bonus for keeping families together. So there are financial incentives to terminate parental rights. And so there are all these pressures that come from the media, from policy, from finances, in addition to a huge multi-billion-dollar foster care industry that, like most huge multi-billion-dollar industries, wants to keep going as is. And so it's hard to make change. And on top of all of that is also a long history of negative stereotypes about black families. And whether it's conscious or subconscious, I think judges, lawyers, social workers have a model of a family that is a nuclear white family. And when they see black families that don't fit the model, they're more likely to think the child will be harmed by staying at home and will be benefited by taking the child away from his or her parents. And that also, I think, affects these judgments. So to change the system, you really have to act at all of these levels. And it is complicated and it's a difficult process, but I think it's important to work toward eliminating these racial disparities and injustices in the child welfare system because it's such an important system. It's so powerful, and the average American hasn't a clue about how powerful it is, but in poor black neighborhoods, everybody knows how powerful it is because everybody is affected by this system.
I can only underscore as a former foster care worker, you would not believe how easy it is to take children, particularly if they are poor and black. You would not believe how easy it is. I wanted you to talk because you in the book provide historical context for this legacy of devaluing black parents and just decimating black families. On page 196, you said that one of the main lessons that mostly black and Latina participants received was not to let their children get in the way of finding a job. Staff either stressed that maternal responsibilities were secondary to paid work or ignored them altogether. The trainers admonished the mothers not to interrupt their job search to tend to sick children and never to mention their children during interviews.
Yes, well, there I was writing about the contradiction between welfare policy and child welfare policy. So you have poor Black and Latina mothers who now, under welfare restructuring passed in 1996, the welfare reform law that ended the entitlement to welfare, that requires mothers to look for work and kicks them off of welfare if they don't find work in time. So those programs and the work programs, and there I was describing the training sessions that welfare recipients go through to help them find a job, again, which is mandated by the new welfare law. They're told that they shouldn't let their children get in the way, and work is emphasized. There is not adequate child care for poor and low-income mothers, working mothers, and they're in the kinds of jobs that are the least flexible. You can't just take off. You can't. It's hard to get sick days. The job often has irregular hours, so you might be working at night sometimes or all the time, and it's not the kind of job where, like the job I have as a professor, where I pretty much control my time. If you're working in a factory or at Walmart or, in a nursing home, or the kinds of low-paid work that women getting off of welfare usually get, there's no latitude for taking care of your kids. And so I was describing programs where these mothers are literally told, forget about your children. Don't let them get in the way of getting a job and keeping a job. And these are the women with the least supports available to them for taking care of their children. They're also, ironically, the exact same women that are most at risk of losing their children to foster care. And so there's this contradiction between one system telling them, just pay attention to getting a job, don't pay attention to your children, and then the other system telling them you're a bad mother, and if you leave your child at home alone so you can work, or if you can't make ends meet on your low-paid wage and you have no extra supports, you can't get good child care, we're going to take your child away from you and put your child in foster care. So they're getting contradictory messages, and the policies are not supporting their ability to take care of their children. And this is why I call this a punitive system. We have a system of child welfare where we expect poor and low-income mothers and fathers to be responsible for taking care of their children under very difficult circumstances with very little public support. And then if the state doesn't step in until something goes wrong, and then they're blamed for not being able to take care of their children and punished by their children being removed from them. And then, only then, the state comes in and says, okay, now you can take parenting classes, and we'll provide counseling, and we might provide some material support for your family. But it's only after we, meaning the state agency, gets custody of the family. And I think it's a sick, pathological way of dealing with poor families' problems. Why not just provide the support before there's a judgment of child abuse and neglect? But that's not the way it's done. It's only after there's an allegation of child abuse and neglect is support offered. And there are exceptions. There's some programs that are better than others, but in terms of the general philosophy of child welfare in this country, it's you're on your own as a parent until something goes wrong, and then the state takes your child away and says, now we'll rehabilitate you as a parent and provide services so you can get your child back. rather than devoting services to families first, before there's a catastrophic problem. And one point I make in Shattered Bonds is that before black children were such a high percentage of the system, most of the money was spent on services to families, to white families. It was only after black children started making up such a huge proportion in the 1970s and 80s that the funding shifted to foster care, and now most of the money is spent on foster care. And so before the 1980s, like in the 1960s, for example, most of the money was spent on services to white families. Today, most of the money is spent on foster care for children of color. And you can't tell me that shift was coincidental. It's a shift in policy, a more caring and compassionate policy toward white children and a more punitive policy that destroys families when black families started making up a greater and greater share of the caseloads.
Wow. I feel like in Shattered Bonds, you just do a phenomenal job of teasing out how people try to make excuses. Everything but I think you talk about in the book. Any and everything is responsible for these disparities except racism, white supremacy. And one of the examples that you picked out in the book, you talked about in San Diego, how Latino households earn about the same amount of income as black families, yet while Latino children were placed in foster care at a rate identical to their proportion of the population, African American children were overrepresented in foster care at a rate 6 times their census proportion. Can you kind of talk about some of the information that in your mind reveals that this is mistreatment because these children are black, these families are black?
Yeah. Well, so there is that historical record that I just mentioned, that the policy changed as black children came into the system. I think that's strong evidence that the policy has to do with race. Again, it's not a coincidence that it just happened to change when black children happened to become a greater and greater share of the caseloads. It turned punitive as a response to black children and black families. So that's one, I think, strong bit of evidence. Also, there are a number of studies that show that decision makers make different judgments when confronted with a black family in similar circumstances to other families. So one, I think, very stark example and vivid example is several studies that have shown that doctors interpret injuries to children as child abuse far more often when the family is black, when the child is black. So the exact same injury to a child, like, for example, a bone fracture, when the child comes to the hospital, doctors are more likely to investigate it as child abuse and determine it's child abuse when the child is black. Another good example is what happens to mothers who use drugs while pregnant. There was one study in the 1990s that showed that black pregnant women were 10 times more likely than white pregnant women to be reported to the authorities by doctors when they discovered that the mother was using drugs while pregnant. And there are many other studies as well that have shown that substance abuse during pregnancy is treated more punitively when it's a black mother who's doing it than when it's a white mother. So there are those kinds of reporting decisions where there's evidence that race makes a difference. And there was a federal study also that concluded that even when families have the same circumstances, black children are more likely to be placed in foster care than white children. And so there's other kinds of studies as well with judges that where judges' decisions in an experiment, were different when they were confronted with a story involving a black family versus a white family. And also you could just say that the statistics are so stark that it just seems strange, it seems implausible that that race doesn't make a difference. Now, some people say, well, race makes a difference because black children are more in need of services. And there have been researchers who have reached this conclusion. There's actually quite a bit of controversy over whether race by itself makes a difference. So, there's social scientists, empirical researchers who will try to control for every possible factor, income and marital status and, lots of different factors, and are able to make race go away after they control for all these factors. Others, like the sociologist Robert Hill, who's one of the leading researchers, has concluded that it's not race by itself, but when you combine race with other factors that make children vulnerable to foster care placement, it increases the chances of a child being placed in foster care. So if you have substance abuse in a black family, that increases the chance versus substance abuse in a white family. So I think Dr. Hill's research is very persuasive as well. And then I think that the argument that black children are more in need of services, it may be true that black children are more in need of services, but to me, that doesn't lead to the conclusion that therefore they should be placed in foster care. So I don't think that's a winning argument, even if it were true. I think that you still have to ask, well, why is it that agencies are using this very intrusive and punitive means of dealing with black children's need for services? So that, to me, is the important question. And I ask audiences when I talk about this, I point out that in some black neighborhoods, 1 out of 10 children has been placed in foster care. And if you look over the course of black children's childhoods, rather than just looking at one point in time, what's the percentage of children in foster care who are black, but ask, over the course of a childhood, how likely is it for a black child versus a white child to be placed in foster care? The disparity is even greater. And in some neighborhoods, as I mentioned, 1 out of 10 black children have been placed in foster care. Now, if that were the case in a white neighborhood, I think people would be up in arms. It would just be alarming. It would be unheard of. If whites could imagine in their neighborhood, if they went down the block and 1 out of 10 children was in foster care, they would just, I think most would say, this is an unjust form of government takeover of families. You could imagine, the Tea Partiers who are all up in arms, because of health care reform. Well, imagine if in their neighborhoods 1 out of 10 children was taken from their home by government agents. There'd be a revolution. And why is it all right for that to happen in black neighborhoods? That question, I think, really gets to the heart of why it is that in this country there's a view that it's all right for these harsh actions to be dealt to black families. And it's a very similar question about mass incarceration and juvenile justice. There's, in the prison system, black men are 8 times as likely as white men to be put in prison. That figure would, if white men were put in prison to that extent, I think there would be a change in the system, and I believe it's the same for the foster care system.
I just want to share this with listeners, kind of the cherry on top of what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
This is from page 67 in your book. The average feeling among caseworkers is if you remove a white child, you stand a chance next morning of facing white parents with their lawyer, reported a former caseworker. There's no similar fear in removing a black or Hispanic child from the home.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about the use of words, which we talk about words and definitions on this program a lot. You're a professor at law, so I'm sure you deal with the semantics and definitions of terms. Can you talk about how the vague and inconsistent definitions of what constitutes neglect or maltreatment, how that plays into child welfare supporting racism, white supremacy?
Yes, okay. So I want to make a comment on both of what the passage you read and also the definition of neglect. And I think both of them play a role. These are 2 additional factors to what I've been talking about that help explain the racial disparities in the system. So in the first passage you read, I mentioned the role of lawyers. And, if in the rare case that a white middle-class family has a child removed from their home, immediately they get a lawyer who comes in aggressively, does what he or she can, and often is successful in having the child returned home. And that's essential because once the child spends any amount of time in foster care, a judge is more likely to say, well, let's just let the child stay there for a while until we solve the problem. And so as a lawyer, you don't want your client's child spending time in foster care, more than a day. But what happens with poor black mothers who can't afford a lawyer and get a public defender, who's overworked in most cases, what happens is they just let it slide. Usually it's almost routine to let it slide, and the child spends, a month in foster care before anything serious happens, and then the judge is more likely to say, well, let's leave things as is until we can come to some resolution about what the mother has to do to get her child back. And so aggressive lawyering is really important, and as this caseworker I quoted points out, just knowing, a caseworker knowing he or she's going to have to deal with an aggressive lawyer, not, someone they're used to dealing with in the court system, that's enough to have them think twice about removing the child. So that is a big part, I think, of why we have the system we do, because of inadequate representation. Also inadequate representation of children who want to go back home, and their voice isn't heard in court. So that's one point. Then in terms of the language, because legislatures want to give social workers and judges a lot of leeway and a lot of discretion in deciding whether a child should be removed from their home and whether there is child abuse and neglect, but mainly neglect. They define what neglect is very broadly. And so sometimes there's not even a definition. It's just a sort of, you're supposed to judge what neglect means on your own. And so that term, when is a child neglected, it's so ambiguous and vague that it leaves room for social workers and judges to import their own value judgments about whether a child is safe at home or not. And by the way, black children are more likely than other children to be removed for neglect as opposed to abuse. And so, abuse is more concrete, even though, as I mentioned earlier, it can be interpreted in various ways. So a broken bone can look like an accident, or it can look like deliberate abuse by a parent. Even that can be interpreted and affected by racial prejudice. But at least there's a broken bone that is some concrete evidence of harm to the child. With neglect, it's much more vague. Now, I'm not saying that neglect isn't harmful. You can have forms of neglect that are just as harmful as physical abuse. If you don't feed a child, the child can starve to death just as they can die from a beating. So I'm not at all saying neglect isn't a serious, can cause serious harm to a child. But neglect could also be not enough food in the house or not enough space in the house. Neglect can be a child sleeping on a mattress with 4 other children in the room. Is that reason to remove a child from the home? Neglect can be infestation of rodents or roaches in an apartment. Neglect can be a child missing too much school. Neglect can be a disagreement between a doctor and a parent about how to deal with a medical problem. And so all of these, it can be a messy house. There's just all sorts of factors that could be judged to be neglect. And so it's very easy for prejudice to weigh in on that judgment, so that the same messy house that a white child is in may not seem as neglectful as a messy house that a black child is in. I think there is a long-held stereotype that black parents are naturally irresponsible. They're inherently irresponsible. And so part of the judgment of whether to remove a child is the question, well, if we intervene, can we get this parent to cooperate? And there's, I think, many times caseworkers think that black parents won't be cooperative, whereas white parents will be, and so they're more willing to work with the white parent to fix the situation than with the black parent. And so, you can get this prejudicial view coming into play with neglect. Substance abuse is another example. We know for a fact that there are many wealthy white parents who are alcoholics and drug users. It's glorified on television. In fact, I often point to the show The Simpsons that used to come on with Ozzie Simpson, right, and Harriet, I think, were their names. Or do I have it right? I think that they every week showed their dysfunctional family with all sorts of, you could say, neglect and abuse going on in the home, but they were paid millions of dollars for having that home, whereas I know that the exact same conditions, I know of cases where the exact same conditions in a poor black home was caused to remove the child from the home. And so movie stars who have substance abuse problems and have children, we don't hear of their children being placed in foster care because there's a judgment that the children are going to be all right because the parents have the means to take care of their children anyway. Whereas you have a poor black mother who has a substance abuse problem, often the doctor will just decide that it's dangerous to send the child home because of their view that a black mother can't take care of the child. I once gave a talk where a doctor was present, and he said to me, listening to you, I agree. I do more often call the Department of Children and Family Services to remove a newborn from a black mother who is a substance abuser, but it's not because she's black, it's because I can tell that she's not going to be able to take care of her baby. And he swore it had nothing to do with racism or race, but it just happened that, in his opinion, these black mothers weren't able to care for their babies. And I think it's very easy for a stereotype to come into play when it's just a judgment call about whether a child risks being neglected. And this is another aspect of it. It's not even whether the child has been neglected. Children can be removed if there's a risk. And so it's even more of a subjective judgment. The casework is predicting the future, and that involves a whole set of judgments that are susceptible to racial bias.
Just pointing out for our listeners what Professor Roberts just shared about doctors, white doctors or white service providers making these judgment calls about whether a child should be removed because they can tell that this black parent is not going to be able to take care of her child sounds eerily similar to what Professor Roberts talks about in Killing the Black Body, where there it's birth control and reproductive issues where we just know this person is not going to be able to take care of their child. They should be sterilized.
Yeah.
They should be on Norplant. They should not have the right to have additional offspring. Again, Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty. Excellent read as well. We already touched on transracial adoption a little bit, but I did want to pick this particular part out because I think it ties right to what we've been discussing, where this push for adoption, there's so many black children in foster care, they need great homes, let's have more adoption, and let's have white people adopt these kids. You wrote about how the white baby famine is driving a lot of this. Can you kind of share what that term means, white baby famine, and your views on if white adoption is going to solve this problem?
Yeah, well, white baby famine relates to the trend of fewer white babies available for adoption. That trend occurred because of birth control and fewer white teenagers giving up their children for adoption than used to occur in the past. Also, the legalization of abortion as well produced fewer white babies available. And so there's a perceived, need for whites to have a bigger pool, a more diverse pool of children to be able to adopt. And that converged with the view that there were so many black children languishing in foster care because of restrictions on whites' ability to adopt black children. In the 1970s, the Black Social Workers Association had a statement against transracial adoption, preferring that black children be adopted by black families. And so there was the federal government actually passed a couple laws banning race matching in adoption, in public adoption from foster care. So there's this sense that's supporting transracial adoption that the solution to all these black children in foster care is to terminate their parents' rights and allow white couples to adopt them. And, in the essay that you were quoting from, I point out that a lot of that is based on myth. It's just a myth, first of all, that you could solve the problem of black children in foster care by removing barriers to white families adopting them, because most white people want to adopt white children. They don't want to adopt black children. And there are not enough whites. It's not that they were prevented from adopting black children. That's the problem. It's because they don't want to adopt black children. I'm not saying there aren't some whites who want to adopt black children. There's some famous ones like Madonna, for example, but they're the exception. Even with the removal of the barriers by Congress, there still are hundreds of thousands of children in foster care, many awaiting adoption. So that's just a myth that whites are the salvation for black children in foster care. What is the solution is for fewer black children to enter foster care in the first place. And that question of why are there so many black children in foster care often gets overlooked in the debate about transracial adoption, where people are jumping to transracial adoption as a solution before they even get to the root cause of why there is this overload of black children awaiting adoption in the first place.
Just for folks who are thinking about Sandra Bullock, The Blind Side, or how that spilled over into her real life, this is from page 172 of Shattered Bonds. You write that ABC Evening News reported that a gala in Boston in February of 2001 celebrated the new citizenship of 75,000 adoptees. The cameras panned a sea of white parents holding Asian and Eastern European children. Of dozens of white adopting parents I have interviewed in 3 years, reported Mary Jo McConaughey in the Los Angeles Times, almost all said they would consider adopting a Latino child abroad before a black child at home. Gloria Hodgman of the National Adoption Center, a federally funded adoption registry, agrees. If these adoptive parents could have adopted a healthy white infant in this country, they would not have gone overseas.
It's, again, I'm sure there are some whites who, and I know a couple, at least, friends of mine, white friends of mine, who made the decision to adopt black children, and that was their first choice. But for the vast majority of whites who adopt in this country, their top choice is a white baby. If they can't get a white baby, in this country, they very often will go overseas to find a white baby who recently has been Russian. There was an increase in adoptions of children from Russia, or a Chinese baby girl, or then a child from Latin America. And the bottom choice is a black child from the foster care system in the United States. The most likely person to adopt a black child from the foster care system in the United States is a single black woman. And again, this is a myth that all these whites are just clamoring to adopt black children out of foster care. Black children, if they're available for adoption, the best hope for them to be adopted is another black person, either a relative of theirs, and increasingly black children are being either placed in kinship care and their relatives getting guardianship or adopting the children, or a black woman who wants to adopt a child who's unrelated to her. But there's a marketplace of children, a market for children out there, and there's a price. It's not as if you pay for children, but there are fees involved, and if you equate the fees with the value of the child, a healthy white baby in America is the most valuable of all children, and that's who whites want to adopt. So it's a myth that white people are going to save the foster care system by adopting black children.
Again, our guest, Kirkland and Ellis, professor of law from Northwestern University, Dorothy E. Roberts, author of Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare.
Let me just say one other thing about this that also shows the politics of it. It's always a question of who can white people adopt? So how can we increase the types of children they are able to adopt so that they can adopt white babies in the United States, they can adopt black children from foster care, they can adopt Russian children from overseas, Asian, Latino, whatever they prefer, their preference, they should be able to pick and choose. Without any requirements that they have to adopt any of them. There was a law professor, Rick Banks, who teaches at Stanford, who once wrote an article saying that allowing people to pick and choose the race of the children they adopt violated the Constitution, and he proposed that you shouldn't be able to pick the race of the child you adopt. Now, I think that would never go over in the United States, but just as a kind of thought experiment, you could imagine if there were a rule that whites who wanted to adopt had to just get whatever race of child, was next on the list. Well, that would shut down, the whole adoption business in a minute, because most of the children available for adoption in the public child welfare system are children of color. And there's no way that you could force. I wouldn't want to do it either, but it's not a matter of what's best for the children. This is about giving whites the privilege to pick the race of the child they want. And it's always framed that way. We never think about the transracial adoption debate about blacks adopting white children. That would be unheard of to many, many people. That would just be an outrage, And so that, I think, is another indication of how this is about racial privilege more than diversity and racial justice for black children.
I don't know anybody that's familiar with Mark Riding and his story. He is a black male, and he has a white female that he is a guardian of. And he can tell you that things work the opposite way.
Right.
With a black person adopting a white child, opposite direction in terms of how aggressive they are to adopt and terminate rights and all of that. Just very interesting.
Yes, well, his story, I heard him interviewed on National Public Radio, I think, and it's interesting that, when a black man adopts a white child, especially a white girl, it's national news. And, he talked about how people feel free to come in, even go up to his daughter and say, "Are you all right?" As if, "Did this man kidnap you? Should we call the police?" And it's such an opposite view of the view that, of course, these black children are going to be better off in white homes, and how can we increase that? No one is arguing that white children, we should increase the numbers of blacks who adopt white children. So it's not about diversity, it's about white privilege.
Well said. In reading your book, one of the things I had not considered, even being a former foster care worker, the theory of group-based harm. Can you talk about how this has the mistreatment of black families and black children and child welfare has ramifications for everybody, all black people?
Yes. Well, I wanted to explain that the harm is not just the harm to individual black children and families, although I think that's important. And I think that individual black children and families should have better representation to help them counter the harm or prevent the harm. But the child welfare system is a huge institution, and it has political impact on groups of people. The fact that blacks are so much more likely to be affected by the child welfare system has an impact on black people as a group in terms of both the way in which blacks are perceived by the broader society, meaning perceived as needing supervision by the state, as well as the effects on blacks' ability to work together on political projects, to struggle for our equality in this country, I think is affected by the disruption of families. And so, in Shattered Bonds, I made a pretty much theoretical argument about this that based on the idea of group harm, also based on the Constitution. There are constitutional protections for families, and in general, in a democracy, we believe that families should be free of state interference to raise their children the way they want to. Generally we think that if you have a government that comes in and takes children away from families, that's a totalitarian government. That's contradictory to a liberal democracy, and yet it goes on in black neighborhoods all over the country. And so since I wrote Shattered Bonds, I have done some research on what I call the racial geography of child welfare. And there I'm looking at the way in which child welfare agencies are concentrated in black neighborhoods, or their work is concentrated in black neighborhoods, and how it has an impact on the entire neighborhood. If you go to big cities around the country and you look at where are the children who have been placed in foster care, they tend to be concentrated in predominantly black neighborhoods. That's true in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in New York, in Chicago. I haven't studied every big city in the country, but those I've looked at, it follows that pattern. And so I call this a racial geography of child welfare because there is a spatial component to it. And so I've done some research looking at the effects of this concentration in black neighborhoods, because every single family in that neighborhood either has been affected directly by the child welfare system, or they have a family member who has, or a neighbor who has, or a friend who has, and all the children in the neighborhood are well aware of the power of the system to come in and disrupt their family. So that is a racial, group-based harm of this system, that it affects the way in which children think about their families, think about the government, think about their freedom in America. And when you combine that with the high risk that they have of going to prison, along with the high risk of going to foster care, it really does make the experience of growing up black in America completely different from the experience of growing up white in America. You are at risk of the state coming in and taking you away from your family, either putting you in foster care, putting you in juvenile detention, or putting you in prison. And that is almost unfathomable harm to children's psyche and to their ability to function in America. And then when you look at it as a collective, it has an impact on black people as a group and our status in this country.
Wow, I noted towards the end of the book, when you're talking about this theory of group-based harm, you make the connections to slavery. And page 233, you wrote that the sale of children apart from their parents was another brutal incarnation of this power. The messages of parental vulnerability and subordination were repeatedly burned into the consciousness of slave parents and children. And just as a former foster care worker and having done supervised visits and went out when we've taken children, I could directly relate to the passage where you wrote that visitation rubs in the fact that the parent has lost authority over her child. As one mother explained, the fact that you are visiting your child in a foster home is a reminder you are, at least for the time being, a failure as a parent. I guess, can you elaborate on just the psychological damage of that, being so vulnerable to having your child taken?
Yeah, as I mentioned, you can go all the way back to slavery, and this was a major component, a major aspect of the oppression of slavery, is that the authority over the slave family was the white master, not the adult black parents. They didn't have authority over their children. The master owned their children and could separate them from their children anytime he wanted to. And in fact, we know that slave families often were separated and sent to different plantations. There was absolutely no right of the slave family to exist. They were completely beholden and under the authority and supervision of the white slave master. And so that the origin of the black family in slavery begins with that inferior status and vulnerability that the black family had. Now, despite that, I think one of the great victories of blacks over oppression was that there were black families that were formed and survived slavery. But it was at a great cost and over very, very and often insurmountable very difficult and insurmountable barriers. So that view, I think, is still present today, that stereotype that black fathers don't have any control of. The stereotype is that black fathers have no interest in their families, and black mothers can't control their children. And this is often comes out in decisions about placing black children in juvenile detention, because of the stereotype that a white child can go home, but a black child who gets in trouble, the exact same offense as a white child, has to go into juvenile detention because their home can't control them. And so that also, I think, that view is mirrored in the high rates of foster care placement in the child welfare system. And and as I was mentioning about the racial geography, that affects black families whether they actually have had a child taken from them or whether they just fear that because they know that it's happened to their neighbors and their friends and and other family members. And so this is something I found in interviews I conducted in Woodlawn, a black neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, that this often came up, the idea that parents felt they didn't have authority over their children because of the foster care system. Not just the children who were placed in foster care, whereas in the passage you read, the mother now has to get permission to see her child. And when she sees her child, it's supervised. It's the foster mother now is viewed as knowing better how to take care of her child. And very often, people forget that the mother even has any right to this child anymore, even when her rights haven't been terminated. I found this so common that people talk about the mother as if she's not a mother. They refer and get advice from the foster mother, who maybe just met the child a few days ago, now is considered an expert on the child, as opposed to the mother who's been raising the child. And so the mother loses all authority. I mean, there's some programs where they will look to the mother's advice and information, but often she's left out altogether, as if she knows nothing about her child who she's been raising and who she loves. And so she's made like an outsider and a stranger to her own children, pleading for the right to even see her child. Then, on the other hand, the child is put into very often a strange home where he or she doesn't get to see the mother, is told that the mother is incapable of taking care of her, and now is under the authority of the foster home. Then that extends as well to children who aren't in foster care, because they know that the state has this power. And so in the interviews I conducted, I heard about children who will say to the parents, I'm going to call DCFS if you don't let me do, what I want to do, because I know you're not the real authority. The DCFS could come in here and take me if I call them up. Now, I don't know how common that is, but it's a story I heard that people are aware of in neighborhoods where there's a lot of child welfare agency involvement. And then I also heard about cases where children return home from foster care and they may be receiving services apart from the family. Even a check that comes directly to the child. So now the child has a kind of independence of the family that also diminishes the authority of the parents in the home. And I found this a very common comment about the impact of the child welfare system in black neighborhoods, that it strips parents of authority, and in both their minds and the minds of children, and how disruptive that is to a family.
We had a lot of people that called in. I want to see if they have any questions, but I
Sure.
wanted to read a passage that kind of hammers home the devastating impact of that sense of vulnerability and losing authority to white people at social services or on the plantation. Mm-hmm. This is page 80 from Shattered Bonds, where mother, she's being asked to share her thoughts on the foster care plan. And she says that she stared at her social worker blankly. The social worker asked, pretend the worker didn't tell you what you have to do. How would you want to deal with this problem if it was entirely up to you? Apparently, this was the first time anyone proposed that the mother have some input in this decision. She looks confused and startled, as if she's so used to thinking within the confines of what she has been told is permissible, that the concept of thinking about what she wants is entirely foreign.
Yeah, that's a very sad aspect of this that also I think is pathological in the way we deal with child welfare in this country, which is once the mother loses her child or custody of her child, she has to act a certain way to get the child back. And what is usually demanded is absolute deference to the social worker, the judge, the foster parent. She's not supposed to express her own opinion. She's supposed to be completely compliant. And very often when black mothers challenge what is being done with their child or complain or just express their own opinion that differs, they're called non-compliant. Literally, that's the term. They're viewed as belligerent. And this also is affected by stereotypes of black women being angry and belligerent. So any disagreement now appears to be, this is an angry black woman who is difficult to control, and she's less likely to get her child back. So what some black women learn to do, in fact, they're advised to do this by their lawyers and by counselors, is just, be docile, be compliant, don't express your opinion. And so they learn to take on this stance as the way to get their child back. And it really is reminiscent of the stereotypes from slavery, the slave who hangs his or her head down low and is obedient. And unfortunately, they feel they have to do that to get their child back, which is their number one goal. And they've seen cases where women who fight back lose custody of their children. So it's a really toxic kind of way of dealing with the parent. And so when in some cases there have been some programs like family team decision making in some states or cities that have a policy of listening to what the parents or other relatives have to say, but it's so foreign to the way this usually operates that sometimes, as in that passage, the parents are they don't know what to do because it's the first time that anyone has treated them as if they really are the parent of the child, which they are.
Wow. I'm going to go to the phone lines, but I did want to make sure I got this stated for the record. I have no doubts that the child welfare system and social services in general is wrought with racism, white supremacists, and specifically with white people who practice racism, white supremacy. As a former foster care worker, my coworkers were racist towards me. Matter of fact, I can just say my white coworkers, my white foster parents, my white parents, and the white foster kids that I worked with, all of them did things that I felt were racist. I even had one of my white foster children call me a nigger. So if that's how they felt about me as a foster care worker, I know they have no regard for any of the folks that they're going to visit and looking at their kids, because I know how they treated me. I was even referenced as combative and rude when I pointed out that one of my coworkers made an error in dealing with one of my reports. So I just wanted to make sure that was stated for the record.
Right. Well, and then you also have to wonder what is happening to black children who are sent out to foreign lands, within the state, where there are few blacks, where the foster parents may never have dealt with a black person before, and where there may not be any kind of inquiry into how they feel about black people. I just spoke in Portland, Oregon last month, and a black woman came up to me and told me about how her grandchildren had been placed in foster care, even though she was willing to take them into her home. She was found unfit because of the size of her apartment, and she said that they sent her children. Now, this is Oregon with a very small black population. They took her children from urban Portland, where at least there's some black community, and put them on farms with white families way out in the boondocks of Oregon. And, you just have to wonder in her opinion, they were working the children. These children have been turned into farmhands on a white farm. And she was just, she was fighting. She was a religious woman. She said, I'm praying, and I was told she goes around with a big sign on the side of her car protesting what happened to her grandchildren. But my heart broke thinking about what is happening to these children.
Yeah, as I said, as a former foster care worker, this sort of thing is routine. Now, the farm, that's what's out there, but
that's because of the state. If you have a state like Oregon that has a small black population that's concentrated in a couple urban areas, and children are sent out to foster care, it's not that unlikely they'll be sent out to rural areas.
Man.
Yeah, that doesn't happen in Chicago, for example, because Chicago has such a large black population that there are black foster parents, and actually in Chicago, most black children are placed with relatives. But in Oregon, Portland has a very small black population. So when black children are placed in foster care, they may be sent away outside of the city to foster homes. The same thing would happen, you can imagine in Nebraska or Oklahoma, where there are black concentrated black neighborhoods in urban areas, but there's still a minority, and there aren't. Most of the state is rural.
Yeah, I can testify to that. Foster children being placed 90 minutes away from their hometown, not uncommon at all. I have done that myself many times.
And then when the mother who's trying to, she's told, okay, you have to get a full-time job or you're not going to get your kids back. You have to do all these things to get your kids back. She's trying to do all that. At the same time, she's got to visit her children. Now, let's say she had 3 children removed from her, and each one is placed at a different location 90 minutes away. She has to visit these children. I mean, she wants to visit them, but how she may not have transportation. Does the state provide transportation? Do they facilitate the visits? If she misses a visit, the social worker may write down in her file, mother does not care about her children because she didn't visit the child. That's a strike against her. And now she's less likely to get the child back. But it's all been set up in a way that it's, in some cases, almost impossible to meet all the requirements to get your child back.
Yep. Right dismal. I want to go to the phone lines. I want to first. Moms are very important. Parents in general, very important. Moms and dads. Moms, very important. Want to make sure dedicate this program to Iris Roberts. Moms are extraordinarily important.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
I don't know if you know that's my. You got that from the dedication to the book. Where did that come from?
You spoke with us last year, and when I
see.
You, I remember.
I mentioned my mom passed away last year. Yeah, my next book is going to be dedicated to my parents.
Right on. We want third visit for that book.
Yes.
Let's see. Person who called in 0644. Never mind. Person who called in 7908. 7908. Your line is open.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Excellent show. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I've personally experienced the system with a sister. I had to take her kids.
Mm-hmm.
I guess one of the questions I would ask is, you mentioned earlier that in the 70s that black social workers took a stand.
Mm-hmm.
when I got involved in my sister's situation, initially it was a white social worker who
Mm-hmm.
came, visited my home, and, I took a firm stance that she couldn't interview my children,
Mm-hmm.
that it was just between me and her
Mm-hmm.
and my sister's kids. And subsequently, a black social worker came.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was recommended to the judge that the kids come stay with me and my wife, but that I was, as you said earlier, I would not be cooperative with the system because I did take a stance. I did not allow her to talk to my children because I noticed that even that is an attempt to get the guardian person's children in the system. She wanted to get my children by herself without me even being involved.
Right. Next thing you know, you've got an allegation against you.
Exactly.
All the children are now, and there's no relative to place them with, and they end up in stranger foster care.
Exactly. But I noticed that when the black social worker came, her and I were a little bit more professionally confrontational, if you want to call it that.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of I still had the same stance that, this is what I would take. What has changed? What dynamic has changed in the social workers training that was different than in the 70s in terms of I found that I had more opposition, at least in my predicament, with the black social workers.
I'm glad you raised that because we've been talking about white system, white social workers, and I did want to raise the point that the system is the same even in cities where you have a large number of black social workers, and it's not necessarily the case that the black social workers will have much of a different attitude. I say necessarily the case. I do think overall that black social workers have been more aware of racism in the child welfare system and have taken more of a stand. So I don't want to equate the two, but I also don't want to equate the race of the social worker and the particular stand he or she's going to take. It's not necessarily the case that every black social worker is going to be that different from the white social workers. And some, I've heard it expressed, as you are now, that sometimes the black social workers are even more aggressive in, fighting with the parents, sometimes because they take the attitude, well, I made it out, why didn't you, kind of attitude. So it's not necessarily strictly along racial lines, but we do have the example in the 1970s of the National Association of Black Social Workers taking a political stand on the issue of transracial adoption, and there really hasn't been that kind of political movement around social workers that we saw then. I'm not sure exactly why the association still exists. There's also a Black Administrators a group association, and they do address issues of race in the child welfare system. So I don't want to make it sound like they're completely silent and there's no political organizing at all. There is, but it's certainly not as, militant as it was in the 1970s. But, that seems to be a general trend across politics in the United States. So I don't know if it's anything particular to social workers. That I'm not the only one to comment on a greater apathy in general among blacks and others in the United States since the civil rights movement. I'm not really sure what specific factors to point to, but I will say that when I talk to groups, very often social workers will say, what can we do? because, there are many who see this problem and want to address it and often feel that their hands are tied by supervisors or by financial incentives, by the lack of resources they have, and there's not much they can do. And I always remind them that they could be a political force. They could unite, especially if they united with administrators, to make a demand that racial disparities end, and that steps be taken to end them. Not just that, we continue to talk about it, but that there be concrete steps and that there be a goal from top administrators to reduce the numbers of black children in foster care, all children in foster care, but in particular black children in foster care.
Thank you for the caller. I want to see if one of the individuals that called in with a block number. Your line is open. Person that called with a block number.
Would that be me?
That would be you.
Yes.
Hi. I don't know. I'm just so overwhelmed listening to the subject. I'm not exactly sure what I want to ask. I've had my own experiences with the foster care system. My goddaughter was a foster child and was adopted along with her half-brother by the woman that she's with now. So they've been with her all of their lives. And I believe her mother's still in foster care. And in my own family, I have two cousins whose mother has had about, somewhere between 13 and 15 children. Every last one of them has been taken by the foster care system. So my little cousins have been adopted out by a white female who vehemently is opposed to them having any contact with their family, with us. So it kind of feels like they've been taken away, somewhere and just, forever separated from the family. So my only hope is that maybe they will remember my grandfather's house as they grow older and, as they get a little older and more independent, find their way back.
Yeah.
But the more I listen to it, it really does just make it to where I don't see how people could deny that it's warfare on black people and on the black family. And I'm just seeing that not much has changed at all from the times of slavery. It's just become more refined. And I'm just amazed at how we keep thinking we've made so much progress, when I hear these things. But I wanted to know if you have any advice on what black parents can do to guard themselves and their children from becoming victims of the system. Because I had a neighbor that said her daughter just got mosquito bites on her face, and someone called Child Protective Services on her.
Yeah. This is part of what I found in my study of racial geography, is that once a neighborhood is so inundated by the child welfare system, it becomes just a common part of the neighborhood dynamic. So it's nothing to call up the child abuse hotline on somebody, whereas that would never happen in a white middle-class neighborhood, for example, but with black families, it happens all the time, and that just increases then their risk of getting involved in the system. It's sort of it's a mushrooming effect because it's so much a part of everybody's life, which I think, again, is pathological that you would have a system that's so punitive be a component of everyday life in a neighborhood. It's difficult to, as a lawyer, my advice, is get a lawyer, but I know that people who are poor and low income can't afford the kind of really aggressive lawyering that it takes to challenge the system, the kind of lawyers that middle class and wealthy people can afford. And so one thing to think about is how we can develop better legal resources for families. There in Chicago, I'm involved with an organization called the Family Defense Center, which is dedicated to representing parents who have been charged with child abuse and neglect. And it provides, on a pro bono basis, meaning free of charge, services to poor families by also be getting fees from wealthy families whose children are involved in the system. And so developing legal resources, private or public, insisting on lawyers, I think is important. And then also parent education and advocacy. This is something I want to turn to in my own work now that I almost finished with the book I've been working on. I think that educating parents about their rights and about resources that are available to them is really important. Most, again, middle-class families, if someone knocks on their door and says, "Let me in, I want to talk to your children," like the caller before, knew to stand up for his rights. That I don't have to let someone talk to my children without a court order, or I don't have to let them in my home without a warrant. But many black families aren't aware of this, and somebody knocks on the door and they let the person in and let the children talk, without any representation. So when I say things like that on behalf of poor black families, people often think, "Oh, well, that's terrible. You're protecting child abusers, and you're using legal tricks to keep the caseworkers out of the home." But that's exactly what wealthy people would do. Why is it that wealthy people should have a right to do it and poor people don't? It's the same right should be applied to anybody. It's a constitutional right. It's not just a right for privileged people. And so there's I think a sense that poor black families should be vulnerable to state agents coming into their home. This has been the case in the welfare system as well, that black families just have no rights, and that their rights are just as important and as strong and should be protected equally as white middle-class family rights.
The other person who called in from a blocked number, your line should be open if you called in from a blocked number.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
Hi. Is pro per the proper terminology when you represent yourself?
Oh, pauper. Well, it comes from pauper, which is a word for poor.
I was thinking, how you have, because I grew up in L.A., and I know it was like 3 group homes just around my neighborhood within walking distance.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of my friends, they were thrown away, basically, like the parents, because of gangs and stuff like that.
Right.
And now I know that this is in the 90s, early 90s or whatever, but now in 2000, I know parents are being forced to give their children like psychotropic drugs and such. And so if they don't want to comply with that, they're getting taken, that way too.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, as far as the pro per, you think that we should be setting up, like maybe, because there's a lot of group homes, should somebody be going around teaching foster parents the rights where they can go maybe represent some of these parents? I mean, since they're already involved, but they just maybe don't have the right information.
Mm-hmm.
Like that be going on?
I think it's a very important aspect of all of this is educating parents about their rights and providing advocacy resources, both in terms of legal advocacy, but also just their own personal advocacy for themselves. knowing their rights, being able to express their rights, and feeling secure and standing up for their rights. I think that's important, but the resources to back them up as well, because it's a very tricky area. As I mentioned, many parents find that if they stand up for their rights, then they're even in greater jeopardy of losing their children permanently. And so there has to be support. Like with any change, it can't just be individuals on their own. There has to be collective support and resources, and those who are privileged with more education, more money, should help to provide the support for those who have less education, less money, less other kinds of resources. But I think that parental education and advocacy would be a great project, for Black organizations, for churches, for any organizations that are interested in supporting our brothers and sisters who have less advantages. I think it's a really important move to make. Also, representation for those children in group homes. Now, the state is supposed to provide guardians ad litem, for example, but in some cases they have attorneys, but very often these children are not represented, and the group home becomes their parent, but a parent who does not necessarily love them or have their best interests in mind. And so when something goes wrong in the group home and someone is accused of fighting or stealing, often these children are kicked out or they run away, and then they're placed in juvenile detention. And this is part of the reason why foster care can become a pipeline to the juvenile justice system, because of the way in which children are treated in many, many group homes, and how easily they're kicked out of them. And so, these children may not have anywhere to turn, any adult representative to come to advocate for them. This is one of the reasons why a child in a group home who gets arrested has a very different outcome of a child in a middle-class family who gets arrested, because the child in the middle-class family is going to go home and have a lawyer represent him, whereas the child in the group home is probably going to go to juvenile detention. And so there's a real need to provide advocacy for these children in group homes.
Person who called in, I believe this is a Skype line. If you called in from a Skype line, you should be on.
Yes, Gus, thanks for taking my call. Great information, Ms. Roberts. I do have one question. Has there been a study authored, or has anybody looked at the percentage of children in the foster system that end up in the penal system?
Oh, yes. I don't have the figures or study handy, but there have been several that have documented that children in foster care are at risk of being placed in juvenile detention or in prisons. The question is not so much does it happen. It does. That's well documented. The question that's being studied, where there's some controversy, is why. Because some people have argued, well, these are children from troubled homes. They have problems, and so that's why they're more likely to get in trouble with the law. And it's not the foster system's fault or responsibility. I strongly disagree with that. I think there is evidence. The Vera Institute conducted a study some years ago. I discussed it in Shattered Bonds that showed that the reason why in New York they found that children in foster care were at greater risk than other children of being placed in juvenile detention was because of the way that the foster care system treated them and responded to arrests. As I mentioned, with group homes, especially not providing any kind of advocacy for the child. In fact, they found that the typical response of a group home when a child was arrested was to kick them out of the group home and close the space to them, as opposed to welcoming them back and getting legal representation for them to fight a criminal record, which is what a parent would do. You know, a parent, most parents, when their child is arrested, if they have the means, they're going to get an attorney for the child and try to keep the child out of juvenile detention. They're not going to kick the child out and just let the child be vulnerable to prosecution. And so the Vera Institute's conclusion was it's the way in which the foster care system treats the children. Also, there is an alarming rate of runaways from foster care, again, especially group homes. And black children are at greater risk. And very often they're running away, you know, not because they're incorrigible bad children, it's because they don't like what's happening to them in the group home or foster home, and they want to be back with their families, and they're trying to get home. It's now sometimes said that it's not so much what they're running away from of what they're running to. They want to be with their families very often. But what happens is once they run away, they get labeled as delinquent children, and in some states they get locked up in juvenile detention. So that's another way in which being in foster care can lead to being involved in the juvenile justice system or adult penal system. And then I also mentioned that when children age out of foster care, in many locations, they are left to fend for themselves. They're dropped off at a homeless shelter without any resources. And what are they supposed to do? You know, how do they get a college education? Where's an adult who can help to guide them? We all know that nowadays children are not ready at 18 to be out on their own. You know, even children who have lots of privileges are not ready sometimes till age 25. They still require support from their parents. So how you could take a child at age 18 and drop them off at a Y or a homeless shelter with no money and no higher education and expect them to survive is beyond me. And, you know, if they get involved in criminal offenses, I don't think it should be so surprising. So that is another reason. So you know, there are many different reasons why, and even if they're not involved in criminal offenses, they're vulnerable to being picked up by the police because they don't have the resources it takes to survive in this country. So that I think that there is very good reason to hold the foster care system responsible for what happens to children when they age out of foster care and or get in trouble with the criminal justice system. They took children from their homes as substitute parents, and they should act like parents and care for these children when they get in trouble, and most of the time they don't do that.
Non-Mighty Wick, if you have a question for Professor Roberts, your line is open.
Thank you. Ms. Roberts. It's been very constructive listening to this broadcast today. My question was actually asked, but yeah, if you have anything else you want to add to this, that'd be great. And it's just more so, what can the individual do when this attack comes their way, and the individual? And it sounds like part of it is knowing your rights and not really cooperating with the attackers. And so, if you have anything you want to add on that, that'd be great.
Again, as a lawyer, I'm very sensitive to this being legal advice and to the kind of skill it takes to navigate this system. It really does take a seasoned, skilled, and trained lawyer to figure out how to keep children out of foster care when a system wants to put the child in foster care, because you've got a situation where you have a whole team of people, a whole legal apparatus that is lined up against the parent. You've got the child welfare agency, you've got the state's attorney that's prosecuting the parent, you have judges, you have the guardian ad litem who is representing the child, who may not be on the parent's side, in fact may be opposed to the parent. You've got the foster parent now who may feel that they have an interest in adopting the child and so is also opposed to the parent. The foster parent may have a lawyer. So there's a whole team. This was very clear to me the first time I went into dependency court, and you see the parent standing there by herself. She's got a public defender, and then a whole team of people who are against her in the courtroom. And so it takes a lot of skill to navigate that whole system, which is why I think it's so important for parents to have adequate legal representation, and we should, to the extent we can and know how to advocate for better representation of parents at every single step of the process. The parent, there should be lawyers for the parent as soon as this whole process is initiated and the representation comes in too late. Okay, so having said that, what happens in the meantime? I think that parents should know their rights and know that you don't have to open your house to anybody unless they have a warrant signed by a judge. And so that is your legal right. Now, I think what would happen if someone were represented by a lawyer, they would negotiate some way to deal with an allegation of abuse and neglect. What happens to people without a lawyer is that they let someone into their home and they may scream and fight, but they may have their child taken away from the home without their ever having any legal representation at all. And so, in my opinion, you should, before you let somebody into your home, try to get some kind of representation. I know that that's difficult for people who don't have any money, or even people who have money. It's an expensive proposition even to know who to call. And so, for a lot of these issues, you have to work on many levels. What do we do in an imperfect system, but at the same time work to change the system so that it's a more just system? I also think that, to the extent we're involved in black organizations, black or racial justice organizations, we should work to put this issue on the table of what the organization is doing. And I think there's so much ignorance about this system and the belief that if you got involved in the system, you must have done something wrong. Kind of similar to the criminal justice system, where many people believe if you're in prison, you must have done something wrong, and you must deserve it. And I think it's now more and more we're realizing that the system is an unjust system, and there are people, behind bars, thousands and thousands of people behind bars, and thousands of children in foster care who should not be there. And these should be issues that are at the forefront of our movement for racial justice.
Professor Roberts, do you have time for one last question?
Sure.
818, I saw you had a hand up. Did you have another question?
Can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I had one more question. I understand two. I'll make it quick. I understand the financial incentive for imprisoning people, being that, you can buy stock at the stock market with the prison system. I was wondering, is there a financial incentive for putting children, black children particularly, into foster care, and for anyone that wanted to advocate or help in keeping black families together, what field of law would they study in order to do that?
Okay. There is a huge financial incentive. The foster care system is a multi-billion-dollar system, and there are agencies, both private and public, but increasingly states are privatizing the agencies that place children in foster care and supervise foster parents and run group homes. And these agencies are receiving state and federal monies to run, and there are people who are employed. And so there's a whole business, a whole industry around keeping children in foster care. And then there are the incentives of while children are in foster care, states receive money from the federal government to help pay for those children to be in foster care. There isn't the same kind of incentive to provide services to keep families in their homes. Now, there's been some changes very recently in federal policy to allow states to apply for those monies that would have gone to foster care to provide services to families. But it's not widespread enough to really change the overall incentives. So the financial incentives right now are for foster care and adoption. They're not for providing services. And there are these big incentives at the federal level, but also at the agency level in terms of renewing contracts, private agencies renewing contracts with the state. What is it that a private agency should do to show that it's succeeded? Well, usually the measures of success are how many children did you get adopted, and how many children are you maintaining in. Am I still on?
Yes, ma'am. We can hear you. I think.
Okay. I don't know why I hear a ringing, but not incentives for how many children did you return home quickly. What if agencies were rated by how many children were returned home quickly and services provided to their parents to keep the children at home? What if that was the rating system? Well, you would see a difference. In other words, your contract is renewed only if you were able to get, 80% of the children back home quickly. But you see that, there's incentives not to do that. There's a financial incentive for the agency to keep the child in foster care because that's how they're getting their money. So, we could change the incentives to make keeping children at home and returning children home quickly a priority, but that's not where the incentives are now. So then also, and just overall, what we need is a whole shift in philosophy so that all these billions of dollars that are being spent on foster care are instead going to families to help them take care of their children. But that would require a whole abolition practically, of well, not entirely, but a big chunk of the foster care industry. And there's a huge lobby of people who have a stake in not making that kind of change. In addition to just the racism in America that many white Americans don't like the idea of their tax dollars going to poor black families. And so there's always been a backlash against programs like the War on Poverty that were perceived as taking white people's money and giving it to black families. And I think that's what a major shift in our child welfare system would look like, and there's resistance to that. So in terms of a legal career, I think that there is a need for more lawyers who are willing to go into this profession, this specialty of representing families. There are very few who do it right now. And most of the lawyers who represent poor and low-income black families are public defenders. I think that's one place you could start. Unfortunately, the public defender system is overloaded, just like it is in the criminal justice area, and there's a lot of inadequate preparation, almost like a assembly line type of justice where cases are just go through the system without very much attention to individual files. This happens in the criminal justice system as well, where young and juvenile justice system, where black children come in and just are put through without any real attention to individual cases. It's really, I think if people knew what goes on behind those courtroom doors to black children and black young people, it should raise a huge alarm. There is very little real representation of poor people, especially at the trial level. And it's mostly, there is no presumption of innocence. I mean, people are presumed guilty. They're forced to plead guilty, not, literally forced, but by their circumstances. And that's what happens in most cases. And so there's a huge need for other kinds of representation, organizations that are dedicated to representing poor and low-income black parents in these cases. And then there's also you were interested primarily in the legal system, or legal as a lawyer. I don't know if the caller is still there. Hello?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Good. Okay, so you were asking about a career in the law that relates to this?
Just, but just anything, just any areas in which we can work as a people to protect and assist our own in that arena.
Right. Okay, so one is, becoming a lawyer and dedicating your career to this very important area of representing poor parents. Now, you're not going to become rich, and there's quite a pull to work in corporate America, but there are many young lawyers who are committed to this, and we need more of them. Then there is the whole field of social work as well, and you can get a degree in social work. You can get an advanced degree in social work, work as a caseworker or as an administrator or at various levels within agencies or at the state level or in policy levels at the federal or state or local levels, but having a role either in working directly with families or with policy relating to child welfare. So going to a school of social work or a school of public administration or a school of social service, there are multiple levels at which you could work, and all are needed. I always say that one thing about this field is there's so much that has to be done at every single level, and that can seem overwhelming, but at the same time it also provides an opportunity, whether you're interested in working directly with families, being a lawyer, public policy, research, there is a need at every single level. And or even volunteering. I've mentioned in answering other questions about the need for parent education and advocacy. When I was writing Shattered Bonds, I got to know a group of black mothers on the south side of Chicago who were meeting just to kind of give themselves moral support, share information. Every once in a while they would try to intervene in some way, go to a public hearing and testify, do something. But they had so few resources. I mean, it was just them. They didn't have any money. They didn't know really. They didn't have professional organizational skills. They didn't have anyone supporting them, and they were all themselves had children or grandchildren in the foster care system, so they were dealing with the everyday work they had to do to keep or get their children back. And I just remember thinking, they had the dedication and the determination and the compassion and the knowledge of the system, but they didn't have the resources that they needed, and eventually the group fell apart. But I thought, if they had some resources, if they had a Xerox machine, a copy machine, and a computer, and a lawyer, and somebody with some public relations expertise, just to give them some assistance, which could be done on a volunteer basis, they would really be a powerful group. But they just couldn't maintain themselves and have the impact they wanted by themselves. They needed the support of the community, and they didn't have that. And so I think there's a role for people who have expertise in the media, in public relations, in finances, in organizing, in community organizing, or just the material means to donate computers or computer skills, public speaking skills, all of that to bring parents together into parent advocacy groups. I think that's a really important part of making a change.
Wow. Phenomenal information, I think. I could be wrong, but it has been, extreme pleasure to have you on the program for a second time to discuss your work. You said you're working on your latest project. It sounds like it's related to the report you did, Race and the New Biocitizen. What's the use of race?
Yes. Yes, it's a book on the politics of the expansion of the view that race is a biological category and how it's being incorporated in genetic science and pharmaceuticals and other kinds of biotechnology. And I have been very alarmed at how this idea that race is biological and not a political category is gaining traction and being supported by big business and the government and scientists who are promoting this. I think that it's scientifically invalid but also politically dangerous, and so that's what my next book is about.
Wow. You said spring of 2011?
Yeah, it's scheduled to come out in spring of 2011. We're working on the title. If you have any ideas for a title, I'd love to know. But we're working on a title for it, so I can't share with you a title yet, but it's going to be published by the New Press, and it is definitely scheduled for publication next spring.
I'll speak for myself. I definitely am looking forward to reading that, and if you're willing to share some of your time with us again, I would love to have you on the program next year.
I would be very happy to talk about my new book. So please remember to get in touch with me. If you don't, I'll get in touch with you.
I will be.
You won't have to ask me. I'll be promoting a new book. I will be elated to have some airtime to talk about it.
Anytime. It has been, like I said, just an incredible honor to have you back on the program. Thank you so much for sharing some of your time and expertise, and we're just super appreciative, and we'll be looking out for the new work.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me again.
No problem. Thank you so much again. Northwestern University, Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law, Dorothy E. Roberts, author of Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, as well as Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, that's the publication, but outstanding work through and through. And look out for the new book. Hopefully she'll be back next year. We're going to take a quick commercial break. Thank you so much for.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks again.
The rest of your weekend, for sure. Quick commercial break. Everybody that called in, you're still with us. Quick commercial, and we'll be right back. Context of White Supremacy.
The second annual Nat Turner Day Weekend Celebration 2010, The Resurrection of Haiti, Friday, August 20th to Sunday, August 22nd, at the Church of the Advocate, 1801 West Diamond Street, Philadelphia, PA, sponsored by the Children of Southampton, featuring Umar Abdullah Johnson, the Irritated Genie of Southeast, Sister Nefertari, Mary Moot Nzinga, the Universal African Dance and Drum Ensemble, the Lest We Forget Black Holocaust Slave Museum, and a special feature, the Nat Turner Day African Insurrection Musical with Brothers Keeper, the African Marketplace, and much, much more. The cost for the entire weekend, $50 for black adults, $25 for black students and children under 12, and $25 for black elders 65 and older. For more information, contact the Children of Southampton at www.ourcause.com. That's www.ourkos.com or 888-817-3235. That's toll free at 888-817-3235.
Context of White Supremacy. Gus T Renegade. I'm very pleased with today's program. Very pleased. Quickly, Children of Southampton, Sister Nefertari, Mary Moot Nzinga. She's been on this program twice. I hope people saw last weekend she was working with the Irritated Genie doing the 3-part series on entertainment. Sister Nefertari will be having their 1-year anniversary program later today. It will be at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Pacific. She's asking folks to call in, questions. They're always talking about racism, white supremacy at Children of Southampton. The web address, ourcause.com, OURKOS.com. Sister Nefertari, I'm going to try and call in to support her efforts, Children of Southampton. Also, we'll be back tomorrow afternoon. Well, I guess depending on where you are, 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Pacific. This is from Khadijah, investor in the cows, and she mailed a trough of guest suggestions, and Elia Jaspin was one, right? Racial cleansing. Paul Kibble, uprooting racism, how white people can work for social justice. He's scheduled to be with us tomorrow. I'm going to confirm with him today, but that's scheduled for tomorrow. Early evening or afternoon, depending on where you are, should be interesting. I'm of the opinion that white people are not going to stop practicing racism, so it should be an interesting discussion. Let's see. Other than that, did I have anything I wanted to share? Yeah, I'll think of it as we go. Everybody that called in, your line is open. Oh, yeah, what I was going to say. I just wanted to remind everybody I have secured a minimum of $1,300 in my PayPal account. It's more than that. So the program will not be ending August 5th, although I still will not have, or actually I don't have right now, a computer. The computer that I'm going to purchase is more expensive than $1,300. It's $2,300 with the protection plan, the computer, and state tax. But since I did not specify all that, I changed my mind recently. The program will be continuing past August 5th. I'll just be requesting investments so that I can have my computer and continue a lot easier. At any rate, I hope Professor Roberts, I hope if you paid attention to her book title, I would love to have her here next year and have all the people who insist that race is a real biological entity, have them here so that she can, ask those questions. I would love to see those folks get loud and rowdy, black and proud, with her research. I'll be quiet now. Everybody that called in, your line is open.
Real quick about state tax. Discovered another state that doesn't have tax, Delaware, and I think Oregon is another one, so that might be a way to cut costs.
Okay. I'll have to keep that in mind. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Good information.
No problem.
Hello. I want to talk about the lawyers. I remember reading a statistic said that United States they graduate more lawyers than any other vocation. And I have two cousins, female, non-white, that are lawyers. And I asked her, but she said, what do you think, Gus? Do you think that you can get that work done without being a lawyer?
I think we've talked before about titles, man. White people put a lot of importance on titles. But I believe Umar Abdullah Johnson, I believe he said that he's very effective. I think he said he's over 90% effective in working for child welfare, going in for cases to advocate for kids specifically in the school system. But he said he's very effective, and he said he's not an attorney. In fact, if I remember correctly, he said that often attorneys seek out his information on how best to deal with cases. So apparently he is not an attorney, but he's according to his own record, he's very successful at this. So apparently not.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir. Oh.
I think that's
I'm sorry for laughing. One of my detractors listened to the show today. I'm sorry. Anyway.
Well, that's good. I like what she said about the public, the people becoming more involved.
Yes, sir.
because one thing I found out, you know, I didn't have a whole lot of legal knowledge, but as a male, when I had to deal with the system with my sister's situation, just not being docile and passive made a difference. It's like she was saying, it seems they look for people who are, you know, more passive and humble and head hung low and things of that nature. That helped. I believe that had I not been involved in the situation, my sister would have lost her kids. I didn't have any legal expertise in terms of understanding law as a professional, but I did have, you know, that militant approach to. I did understand that the system was attempting to, you know, take her children, and not that she hadn't done some things that needed to be looked at, but at the same time, had she not had someone in her corner who was just, you know, a firm presence to advocate on her behalf, and me being with the kids and taking that authority against the system, she would not have them today, I believe. But I think that until we get to a point to where people are going into this field as protectors or people who are trying to protect black families, I think that it's equally important, or probably as important, or if not more, that the public get more knowledgeable, particularly black men, because, you know, the more we involved and the more we show our presence, I think we'll probably see some differences. Still there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I thought I had lost you guys. But
no. I agree.
Yeah, that's my take on it. I mean, lawyers having that legal representation would be great. But ironically, in my situation, and I'll say this, it was a white lawyer who, because like she said, late in the process, the system appoints a lawyer for the children, and happened to be a white female who really gave me a lot of information. Because she was actually against the system. At least that's what she told me. So I'm just taking her word for it. So she gave me a lot of information. And in keeping with what she was saying about foster care, you know, the monies that are involved that the foster parents get, I found it ironic, and I thought about this at the situation or during the time, is that they did not want my wife and I to adopt my niece and nephew, and they kind of steered us on a course of guardianship. And we found out much later, now we're in the state of Texas, that children who go into foster care, you know, have, like you said, the monies that come for them. And I believe here there is also where their college is paid for, you know. So they kind of steered us away from, you know, which I probably wouldn't have did anyway, but just the irony and the fact that they steered us away from the adoption process. I just was under the impression that maybe, you know, they didn't want those kids to have access to certain funds, because it certainly wouldn't have been for our use, you know, but, you know, their education would have been paid for and things of that nature.
Yeah. She talks about that in the book as well. Shattered Bond, she talks about how foster care is, you get a lot more money, a lot more resources from white people, and exactly what you're talking about, that those, I think the term she uses in the book is those kinship situations where a relative is keeping the children, where I mean, in fact, she talks about how white people are able to make it bad both ways. Like they can steer you away from being a foster parent so that you don't get those extra funds. And then if you do go foster parent and you get those extra funds, now they have more access to you. So they can come in, disrupt things. Like just white people can make it bad any way you go. Like that's what white supremacy means pretty much. But I thought your suggestions about just becoming more informed and just viewing this as a problem that we need to invest some time and energy in, I think that's right on.
Yeah, we have to also, something else I noted, during that whole, as you just said about them, coming into your home now and have more access to you, you actually, become a part of the system yourself. Your kids, become a part of the system. Now your name is in the hat. It's almost like you're selling yourself for a few pennies. But it was something else that crossed my mind when you were saying what you just said. But we just have to be mindful of the fact also that the best thing for us to do is not allow them to have access to our children, because this lady actually wanted to, take my children in a different room and ask them how they're being treated, are they happy at home, and things of that nature. My comment to her, because I asked what kind of questions would you want to ask my children, and I say, well, my kid probably didn't get a candy bar he wanted today. And you're going to ask an 8-year-old, is he happy? And the first thing that pops in his mind is, I'm not happy right now because I didn't get my candy bar that I asked for. So we just have to be really mindful of I think that I always go back, in my mind, that if you don't understand racism, white supremacy, what it is, how it works, everything else you understand will only confuse you. And if we, you got to have that, whenever you're dealing with anything that's involved with the system, which the system is all-encompassing, but particularly the representatives of the system, you have to always be mindful not to get yourself entangled, in their paper trail. But interesting program. I mean, I could relate to everything she said. It was on point, and I'm thankful. It actually reinvigorated in me, because this happened about 4 years ago. And I had the kids for 2 years, or we had the kids for 2 years. But even that, as a sibling, I decided that, the only person you can talk to, and this again is being firm with the system, at least that was the approach that I took, that the only person you could talk to was me. I didn't allow, I didn't allow, but I encouraged my wife not to speak to the social workers unless it was, and then we were on the same page, unless I wasn't at home and things of that nature. And we were, she had the same approach that I had. But I tried to keep it as much as I could between me, the social worker, and my sister, versus the whole entire family getting involved. But education is the key in terms of understanding. But it just was a great show, man. Thank you for it, and just a great show. Reinvigorate again me the desire to talk about it more, and that there is a need for everyday people to share what their experiences are and try to gain some understanding.
I was just thinking about my upbringing as well, and I wanted to say I think it's really important that parents speak to their children, let their children know how that system works and what the agenda is. Like my mother used to tell me, do not talk about my business and what goes on in this house outside of our house. And I think other than advising our children to do that, it's very important to let them understand why people would ask them certain questions and how they might try to lead them in certain directions. even as far as trying to set parents up for child molestation charges, for children that have never been molested, but to take them out of the home. And I think that's one really important defense mechanism that we can make, is educating our children on how that works and what the agenda is and how they practice deception in that area, and how that can be used to tear families apart and let them know, call in 911 and alleging abuse when there is none. It's not going to get you a free ticket to do what you want, but will get you in foster homes and in a system that doesn't care about you, and you may not see your family again. I think it's really important to school them on that.
You're right. My niece would actually, can you hear me?
You sound a little distant, like you're on speakerphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. My niece would actually cry. It took a while. And she said, what she talked about earlier is that, the fear that would overwhelm her, because she knew that this lady, now this was, again, it was almost like they sicked the black social worker on me, but my niece knew, without us even telling her, that this lady stands between you going back with your mother. And she would actually, cry on those days when she would be coming. She would be nervous and all those things. And I did use that, as you just said, as a moment to educate my children, because they actually witnessed it. And it was ironic, and this is what I thought about, Gus, when a statement that you made is that I have a form of discipline for my kids. My boys. I have a daughter now, but and they actually came into my home and said that I could not discipline my niece and nephew. And my question to them was, well, you want to divide my home, because if I allow my niece and nephew to get away with things and not allow my kids to get away with those same things, then you're dividing my home. So they come in also to divide your home. Some kids will see that and say, well, I can call it CPS, because they are the authority. But you have to remain the authority in your home. And you're right, you have to use those moments, teach your children about the system. And my boys, who are old enough to understand, learned a lot from the experience that their cousins went through. And I use those moments to teach them, and they know CPS is not your friend. And I'm not saying there aren't cases where they shouldn't be involved, in those cases where that's necessary. But there are, in many situations, where they do overstep their bounds. As she said, and everything rings true that she said, that somebody just calls in the neighborhood. And that's exactly what happened. Someone just calls, that the community becomes the police or CPS. And all they have to do is make an accusation.
And I think we should remember one of Mr. Neely Fuller's points from the code, which is stop snitching on each other. If you think something's going on with the child, people will say, I don't want to, get confrontational with the parents and get into it. But it's much more harmful to go to a white authority system to have them check on a child in their situation than for you to just ask a parent, hey, is everything okay? I noticed your child has some bites or marks or whatever. Do you need any help? You need any balm or some, you know what I mean? But some type of way to show consideration and care and concern for each other, rather than always running back to that oppressive system. Because the climate I notice in this country as well is they're definitely determined to undermine parental authority. And, the thing is, a lot of our behavior, we get rewarded for snitching on each other and mistreating each other. And it could be your child next. I've known a couple of black females, and they were best friends, and one started dating a guy and was engaged to him, and the other got jealous and called Child Protective Services and made an accusation of molestation. To this day, I don't know if it was true or if it happened or not, but I do know the child was taken out of the home for a very long time, and it caused division in that family. She didn't go to her friend, and discuss anything with her. She just called Child Protective Services. I think we need to work on being able to resolve issues among ourselves in our own communities before going to white people's institutions, because I'm of the belief that they don't intend us any good.
Yeah, that child care system is a big system. Like I said, there was a lot of group homes in L.A., and I know people probably be tripping on Gus. Well, not so much Gus, but I know he talks about sex a lot, and how that is a major aspect, a major aspect of the abuse and whatnot. But I tell you, those group homes, the ones for, like, we had one that was strictly for girls, and it was like it was like I don't know how to, maybe not it was like a whorehouse, or kind of like it was it was a bad. We didn't know it was bad because we was kids. We just knew that that's where you go. Over there, the gang of girls over there, you know what I'm saying, and they're easy or whatever. And now it's like when I grew, when I learned when I grew up, I was like, wow, man, those kids were abused, and we were all just screwed up, growing up. Even growing up in pretty nice families or whatever, you still was just confused. And I know me and my friends would be like, man, you know what? We don't trust nobody over 30. We not going, we wanted to be like the most intelligent generation, because we was like, these people that call themselves parents and whatnot, they ain't got no right to be calling themselves parents. They just throwing us away, and we would definitely want to be against that, and like maybe raise our kids differently. Like you said, tell them about the system, talk to them, not to underestimate them or stuff like that. But yeah, it was those group homes were terrible. Looking back at it, I mean.
And you know what? There's someone, I won't say he's in my family, but someone who had married someone in my family. And over the course of the years, we found out that he had raped one child in the family for at least 5 years, raped and assaulted another female in the family, molested at least 3 others, possibly the boys as well. And come to find out after the fact, and it's in no way an excuse, but just to show you how the cycle of victimization works and being in environments where no one's there to protect you, he was molested by, I think it was a foster parent or someone in a group home when he was a child. And I just heard that there is a lot of abuse that goes on in some of these foster homes as well by some of the foster parents. But it really can cause a disruption in the life of the child who's not even the one that calls. Like, I was in a clothing store, and I turned around and was like, oh, my God, I saw a black female shopping in the store with her butt cheeks literally hanging out of whatever it was she was wearing. And I told her, hey, are you aware, there were children shopping in the store? And she told me, oh, I'm working. She was a prostitute. But when I started to ask her how she got in that situation, she started to tell me about her childhood and how one of her siblings called Child Protective Services or something on her mother. It tore them all in different directions, and basically she just grew up on the streets, without anyone. I could see the scars on her, across her neck, where she had slit her throat trying to kill herself before. You know, and you just see all the sad fallout of these types of family disruptions.
As a parent, I'll say this, is I'm a witness that if you teach your kids the truth, they'll receive it, you know, for the most part. I mean, because there's so much negativity on television, which is, you know, something that we shouldn't partake of too much, radio. So the challenges are, as a parent today, the challenges are much different than they probably were when I was a kid. I'm in my 40s. You just got to teach your kids the truth about everything. And it works. And, you know, I remember when I wasn't teaching my kids the truth and the challenges that we faced. And when you think about what, and I'm just piggybacking on what the other gentleman was saying about parenting, parents over 30, and not trust anyone over 30. If you just think about how liberating it feels when you embrace certain truths, then imagine how liberating that is for your children as well. You know, when it's just like when we teach them about Santa Claus, and I won't go on and on, but just, you know, it's sad that, you know, hopefully we can be, you know, parents in this generation. That old mantra, each one teach one. A friend and I were just talking about this the other day. You know, it's no longer a qualified mantra, a qualifying mantra, because each one is not able to teach one anymore. Now, those of us who know certain things, and not that we're any better or special, we just happen to know some things, we happen to be seeing things from a different perspective. It is our responsibility now to teach 3 and 4, you know, people what we may have information about. We can't say each one teach one anymore. We have to be trying to teach 3 and 4 people, because that's the only way we're going to, you know, be able to combat this system in the future. And that's the feeling I get when I look at my kids, how they're already counter racist as young people. And it was not by my efforts in terms of, I said, here, you take this information, you just regurgitate what I say, but it was just for me giving them the truth and then giving them the things to observe that validates that truth. And the rest just, everything else just took off on its own. So that's in all things, in every area of people activity. That's what I introduce to them, is the truth of the system. And it makes a difference. It makes it when I turn off the TV, I don't have to hear why, you know. Or not say don't watch that program. We watch a program, let's watch it together and let's see what it's saying. And the same way, even with, you know, dealing with this social work system. You know, when their friends are at work, talking at school, rather, talking about they're going to call CPS on their parents, or, you know, your kids have to know, because if they don't know, then they will wonder if there's a power that they have to use over their parents. So if you teach them the truth, then they'll accept it. And if they don't accept it, then you just have to, you know, accept that. Because I can go into some of the ancient sayings that refer to what we do when our child does not accept the truths that we're saying, and basically just old adages that you just have to let them go, because they're not your child. They're a child of the system, and unfortunately, many times we find our kids becoming a child of the system. And I have told my kids that you got the choice of two fathers, two influences. That's me or the system. I'm going to be the father that's going to teach you the truth. The other father is going to teach you the lie. And your kids have to make conscious decisions. But if you don't give them, if you keep giving them falsehoods, then they're going to make decisions that are more geared towards the ideologies of society.
Yeah, I agree with you, man. Teach them the truth. You know, that's all you can. That's what you should do. And I think that people should recognize an opportunity when it presents itself. I mean, if you're getting abused by the system in a particular way, to me that's an opportunity for you now to work in that work in that field. You know, you have an experience. You know, they tried to do this, or your sisters, or well, not you personally, but I'm just saying whoever. You know, if they have a personal contact with the system, to me, I feel like that's an opportunity to learn as much as you can, and maybe work for 5 years, and then teach somebody, you know, all the work that you've done, and then they can carry on, and you can do something else. But people, like what you were saying, that, you know, now that they want to interview your kids, so people get into these systems and then they get scared. They feel like, no, they're going to be on the radar, when it should be just the opposite. It should be like, okay, this must be why this is even, you know, in my life or whatever. This work needs to be done. It's like obvious right there. And then, but people get scared and they don't pursue it. They don't do anything. They don't do no work. And then I don't know. It's just, I just think those are opportunities. Everybody everybody on this phone has some type of issue with this social service and child welfare and all this stuff. But some more than others, you know.
We have about 6 minutes left. Context of White Supremacy. Again, we should be back tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific. I just wanted to say on the program, Irritated Genie is an investor in the cows, as well as the fine work he does at Warm Horizon. I wanted that on the record. Their investment, very helpful. And P.S. 818. Don't send me any more emails with Rosaria Dawson doing anything sexual with a white person. It's sad. I think she's gorgeous, non-white female. I think she has a white parent, but she's in just a ton of films, being a sexual toilet for white people. It's too many to name. They even have her doing Spike Lee. I don't know if you all saw 25th Hour, but they even got some pedophilia there with I forget, Ed Norton. He is her sexual partner in that film, and it shows how they met. She was in high school, and it's got her with like the uniform on, the skirt and everything, schoolgirl outfit, and he comes up to her on the playground, literally. Like, that's how they met. In Spike Lee's 25th Hour. He didn't write the script, though. But yeah, don't send me any more emails with Rosaria Dawson being victimized sexually by racist white men.
I will not. I'm not extremely familiar with most of her work, so I came across that, and I wondered, had you seen that? But, you know, I have to wonder, with all of those the people that are in these roles, as many as they do, I have to wonder sometimes, are they like mind controlled or brainwashed? Like, do they not get what they're endorsing and that there's a consistency in these roles that they're playing?
No. And they're paid a lot. I mean, I think they're just very confused. And they're paid a lot.
Hey, was Rosario Dawson in that movie, Alexander?
Yes.
That was her? Wow.
Yep. I think she was super sexualized there. She was Rent. She was a AIDS victim she was a crackhead AIDS victim, some kind of drug abuser who had AIDS and ended up with a white person. Like I said, 25th Hour. She's hypersexualized. And Descent, I did a counter-racist film review of that. It's on my blog. She gets raped by a white guy, and he calls her a niglet, a nigger with an attitude, a baboon. While he's raping her, he's calling her all these things. Yeah, I mean, her film record is, man. I think 7 pounds is about as good as it gets for her.
The program today also made me think about what the irritated genie said that the white female told him in that meeting before about white people not thinking black people were capable of raising their own children and that white people should just do it instead.
Mm.
Hey, Gus, what did she say about her colleague? I didn't catch the beginning of the show.
She said she was not familiar with Cheryl Judy. She said apparently the law school at Northwestern is separate from the main campus. So she said she doesn't know as many people that are part of the main campus, but she said she would look for Professor Judice's work, and she said she was looking to work on a project similar to that. I don't know what her take will be, but she has a white parent. That's interesting too. Yeah, that's at the beginning of the broadcast. You got to go back to the very beginning to hear all that. But yeah, she does. She wasn't familiar with Professor Judice.
It also made me think about the buffer class, versus it being the offspring of mixed black and non-white. Made me think about just another buffer class of people who have been raised by whites, and they have this, endearment towards them, and they'll be blind if they are, if they see themselves as benefiting from being raised in those homes, and they themselves will be also blind to the system of white supremacy. So I looked at just another, because as Brother Baruti said, that in about 10 years, we're not going to see this interracial thing because white people are going to get tired of it. So they still have to find ways to create a buffer class. And that made me think about some of that when she talked about the overwhelming numbers of blacks who are going into the foster system.
Pretty much done.